This is from the Gospel of Mark, chapter 9, verses 14 and following. Jesus is just coming down from the mountain with his disciples, Peter, James, and John, where he's been glorified, transfigured, his glory shining in the world. And this is what it says. When they came to the disciples, they saw a great crowd around them and scribes arguing with them. And immediately all the crowd, when they saw him, were greatly amazed and ran up to him and greeted him. And he asked them, "What are you arguing about with them?" Someone from the crowd answered, "Teacher, I brought my son to you, for he has a spirit that makes him mute. And whenever it seizes him, it throws him down. He foams and grinds his teeth and becomes rigid. So I asked your disciples to cast it out, and they were not able." And he answered them, "O faithless generation, how long am I to be with you? How long am I to bear with you?" It could be translated, "How long shall I put up with you? Bring him to me." And they brought the boy to him, and when the spirit saw him, immediately convulsed the boy. He fell to the ground, rolled about, foaming at the mouth. Jesus asked his father, "How long has this been happening to him?" And he said, "From childhood. And it has often cast him into fire and into water to destroy him. But if you can do anything, have compassion on us and help us." And Jesus said to him, if you can, all things are possible for one who believes." And immediately the father of the child cried out and said, "I believe, help my unbelief." When Jesus saw a crowd running together, he rebuked the unclean spirit, saying, "You mute and deaf spirit, I command you, come out of him and never enter him again." And after crying out and convulsing him terribly, it came out, and the boy was like a corpse, and most of them said, "He's dead." But Jesus took him by the hand and lifted him up, and he arose. And when he had entered the house, his disciples asked him privately, "Why could we not cast it out?" And he said to them, "This kind cannot be driven out by anything but by prayer." And again, may God bless the reading of his word, and please be seated. So I actually worked in this sermon a while ago, and maybe a month ago, and then last week I had to change it because my cause of crying out, "I believe, help my unbelief," struck. Because a man I'd worked with for a while, not all that closely, not all that long, but a man I'd worked with in Christian ministry fell. He had a rough life. A number of things went wrong professionally in his family. He experienced real hardship. He turned to alcohol, and it cascaded downward from there. And he's out of the ministry. And I fell into a reverie of remembering the people I had worked beside, the people who endorsed my books, people who were on a committee with me, on a team with me, and they're gone because they betrayed their gospel witness. I'm not saying they're not believers. I'm saying they committed serious sins that disqualified them from ministry. And I cried out, "Lord, why? Why do Christian leaders so often fail?" It's what causes me to say, "Lord, I believe. Why don't you preserve your leaders and your people better?" It's where I have my "I believe, help my unbelief" crisis. And then I thought about this church, and honestly about the 1-year anniversary of the passing of a beloved leader, Harry Reeder, who finished his life well, very well, and was faithful to the end. And then I thought about this church beyond Harry, to consider, to remember that for 65 years, this church has had pastors, lead pastors, who are gifted, hardworking, dedicated, godly, intent on a life of faith. And I think, of course, of Frank and Harry first, Harry especially today. But I also remember, and I know, and I think many of you know, that we've had a long procession of assistant pastors and associate pastors and youth directors and ministry of music and ministry of women, and they've been faithful and faithful and faithful. I don't know if you realize what a profound blessing you have to have decades of one faithful leader after another. So I hope you give thanks with me as we consider the sorrow of leaders not leading as they should and the joy of the leaders here. Mark 9 is about a challenging day in the life of a person, a father who loves his son. He loves his son, and he's watched his son suffer for that boy's entire life. And probably he had hopes of his son's healing, and the hopes were dashed. And now he hears about Jesus, the healer, and he thinks, maybe there's hope after all. And he brings his son to Jesus. Now, as he does, we're in one of those moments of contrast. And the contrast is between great things that have been happening in the Gospels in Mark chapter 9. Earlier in Mark 9, Jesus walked on water, walked to his disciples in a storm, and Peter, although he faltered, did walk all the way to Jesus on the waves. That's quite an event. And then right after that, Jesus went up on a mountain to pray with his disciples. Peter, James, and John was transfigured, shining in all of his glory, all of his deity shining through. And as so often happens, the highs lead to lows. Now, the grads were here and their families were here at the first service, but you know the way it is. There are probably some grads that were honored and are honored and will be honored. And you know the way it goes in families. One child has an honor, maybe valedictorian or getting some award for excellence in debating or sports or something, and everybody's celebrating. And then, you know, the sibling's kind of glad, but not exactly glad about all the attention being lavished on brother or sister. And next thing you know, there's verbal fisticuffs breaking out somewhere out back, and mom and dad are playing private investigators because the highs and the lows tend to go together in life. And so it is here. After the great victory of the letdown, Jesus comes down from the mountain and he sees this group of people, a mess, people arguing, debating, quarreling. What are they talking about, he asks. And someone runs over and says, okay, here's the story. There's a man who brought his son to Jesus, and Jesus wasn't here. And so they said, well, take him to the disciples. The disciples, they know how to heal. They've been empowered by Jesus, and they don't do it. The healing doesn't occur, and nobody seems to know why. And so Jesus asks about the uproar, and somebody comes forward. It's the father, and he says, teacher, I brought my son to you. Over in Matthew, he calls him Lord. He pleads for mercy. Help my son, he says. He has terrible seizures. He's got an illness, and there's demonic forces that are somehow weaponizing and compounding my son's illness. He has seizures, but he doesn't just fall down. When he falls down, he falls into a fire. He falls into water. He doesn't fall at random. He falls in the most destructive way possible. There's a demon trying to destroy my son. It's been going on his entire life. And he says two things. He says, I brought my son to you. That's verse 17. And I brought him to your disciples. Now what he means is this: when my son and I finally had hope again, I brought my son to you, and you weren't here. And so I presented him to your disciples. They're your agents. They're your, can I use the word, plenipotentiaries. You've given them all of your power. We know you. What went wrong? Our hopes are dashed. They were not able. It's not foolishness. It's true. The representatives of Christ should be kind of like Christ. They should have a Christ-formed, Christ-shaped life. That's one reason why today we remember a pastor, Harry Reeder, who had a Christ-formed, Christ-shaped life. And not him alone, but we've had many other pastors, and we give thanks for that. That's the way it's supposed to be. All of us are supposed to represent Christ in this world, and his beauty and his goodness and his kindness and his wisdom, and it doesn't always happen that way. Can I just pause and meditate on this? Because it's a big issue in our culture today. There are probably three ways a pastor can fail or seem to fail as people. One is by just being a human. And so, pull back the curtain a little bit. Sometimes when pastors are complaining, which they do once in a while, they will say, I can't believe this person has been mad at me for 10 years because I didn't answer their phone call while my wife was giving birth to our first child. I had a fever of 105. It is true, I didn't get the list to them on time. I had a fever of 105. All right, so pastors are human, that's small. The main problem is that pastors sin, and they do. Christian leaders sin, elders and deacons and Sunday school teachers sin, and sometimes it's terrible. Sometimes it's major sin, betrayals, misusing money, breaking vows, and it's a tragedy. And our only hope is that people will remember and give us some of the grace that Christ gives us. The church is a hospital, and we don't want to stay in a hospital forever, but we land in hospitals. And we need to recover. That's what the church is, a school where we learn. It's also a hospital where we recover. And so even a leader, we hate it, but even leaders sin, and we hope they recover. And then there's another category, and that is when leaders fail, I'm going to call it culpably, but maybe not sinfully. And that happens when a leader is in a tough spot and they don't quite know what to do, and the decision's called for now. There's a crisis right now. We have to do something. We don't know what to do, and we're going to do the best we can, and we make a mistake. We don't mean to make a mistake, but we make a mistake. I'm going to tell about the most recent time I did this, not long ago at all. In fact, about a week ago, we were having a family gathering, Mother's Day. And, the family's there, and I have a grandson who's pretty athletic. He's 7 years old, and he likes to play every sport known to humanity, and that includes soccer. And he's not a goalie, but he likes to pretend he's a goalie. And he likes to have people score. And so somebody else from the family is kicking goals or trying to kick goals against him. There's just a wall, and you got to hit it between the two angels. And this family member played soccer. And so he's trying to score on my grandson, and he's not succeeding. He's blocking one shot after another. He's only 7. And so this relative of mine starts kicking harder. And seems like everybody should see what's happening. I mean, this wonderful young man is just kind of getting excited because he played soccer and he's kicking harder and harder, and a ball rockets over my grandson's head. And I'm thinking, that's like a bullet path. I mean, he hit that hard. And his dad's right there and his mom's right there. I think they're seeing this. They're seeing the ball going harder and harder. And I'm getting worried. And I'm thinking, I see this happening. The parents see it happening. Why doesn't anybody but me care? And I don't want to step on their toes, I don't want to usurp the role of mom and dad. And mom and dad aren't doing anything. And then one more kick comes, and sure enough, my grandson blocks the shot, and he's hurt, not badly, but hurt enough to cry. And I think, I saw it coming, and I didn't say anything because I thought his dad saw it, and his dad said, no, I wasn't paying attention. Like, those are sonic booms going off. How could you not hear that? That's not what I said. What I said was, I am so sorry. I saw it coming. I should have stopped it. I thought you saw. They said, we didn't see. We were watching. And we all make mistakes like that. I felt terrible. I felt guilty. I don't think I sinned. It's hard to be sure. I just made a bad judgment. We all make bad judgments. And the disciples of Jesus make bad judgments. We fail. The disciples failed. We don't know exactly why they failed. Jesus says later on, because you had little faith. He says, because you didn't pray. Maybe they assumed, we've officiated a lot of healings by now. Maybe they were mailing it in. Maybe they were not as zealous as they could have been. Maybe they were distracted. It didn't work out. Maybe life is hard sometimes. And leaders let us down. And they let this man down. And so the man is shaken. And Jesus laments as he sees it. He says, oh, faithless generation, O unbelieving generation, how long shall I bear with you? How long will I be with you? How much more do I have to put up with you? We almost hear him saying, I'm going to leave this world before too long. How long do I have to be with you? Do you hear Jesus getting exasperated? Do you hear it? Does it bother you that Jesus got exasperated? Can you imagine that there's such a thing as a holy exasperation? A man named B.B. Warfield, 110 years ago, said, Jesus had every godly human emotion. He had every human emotion and in a godly way. Now, some people say sometimes that, you should never get angry. There's a series of movies called Star Wars that has a line about this. I don't know if you've ever heard about these movies, but Star Wars has these creatures called Jedi Knights. And there's a code for Jedi Knights, and they can go over to the dark side or stay on the right side. In case you didn't know, I'm just summarizing for you. And one of the things they say is that anger is the path to the dark side. It's not true. Star Wars is not correct. Do not get your theology or your philosophy of life from Star Wars. There is such a thing as godless anger, and there's such a thing as godly anger. It is proper at times to get angry about sin and injustice and hatred and unkindness. And the Bible actually says, be angry and do not sin, which means it's possible to be angry sinlessly. It's not easy for us. Let me say it a different way. The book of Ecclesiastes says there is a time to weep and a time to mourn, a time to laugh, a time to dance. There's a place for every emotion. If I can just talk about that a little bit more, there's a man named Robert Roberts, who's a Christian theologian and leader and a wonderful man, and he wrote a book about emotions. And he said, when we say things like, don't be so emotional, we're actually probably off and not recognizing that God made humans with emotions. And emotions are fundamentally good and they're a proper part of life. And our emotions arise when we care, sometimes passionately, about something. Our emotions are the way we appraise events, the way we construe what's happening around us. He uses this illustration. He said, imagine that somebody comes rushing at you with a sword. Imagine you're in a terrible, dark city, Atlanta, for example, and you're supposed to laugh at that. I'm not actually against. I don't really mean that Atlanta's a horrible city. But you're in New York or some crime-ridden city like St. Louis or someplace, and somebody comes charging you with a sword, in an alley, and they're angry and they're large and it's flashing and you're terrified. You run, you're afraid. But imagine that someone comes rushing at you with a sword, and instead of being on a lonely street in a faraway city, you're an actor and you're on stage. And you're thrilled because this is your big scene. This is your battle scene. You're in a Shakespearean play, and this is it. You're not frightened at all. Or imagine that you're at a picnic and your 4-year-old nephew comes charging you with a sword made of foam rubber, and you're amused because of the way you read the situation. Our emotions are how we read things, and we have to read things well, not badly. Now, the book of Proverbs says, above all else, guard your heart, for from it come the well springs of life. That is to say, your actions, your thoughts, and also your emotions come from your heart. Emotions come over us, but they don't merely come over us, they come out of our heart, out of our passions, our desires, our interests. Suppose, for example, and this is a good Sunday for this because college sports aren't going on, but suppose, for example, that you're a fan of one of those big schools, Alabama and Auburn, and your wonderful school, the school you root for, the school you live and die for, loses. And they lose because some large young man, maybe 6'9", a basketball player, maybe 6'2" and 282 pounds and a football player, makes some mistake, some ball dribbles out of their hands. They try to catch it and they just can't quite, and they fumble it, and it goes out of bounds, or it's a turnover of some kind, and your team is lost. I have heard from serious-minded people that attendance at this church goes down after Alabama loses a significant football game, especially if it involves, tragic accidents by large 19-year-olds. That people are so distraught that Alabama or Auburn lost a game based on the performance of a total stranger, may I say, somebody you should care about a little, like you care about same way you care about people who live in Mongolia, that kind of care. Someone has defective fingertips and people can't get out of bed till 1 p.m. the next day. I'm just going to tell you something. If you can't come to church because Alabama or Auburn lose a football game, your emotions are out of order. You care too much about a small thing, unless you're the football coach there, that would be different. We should care deeply about the right things. We should be angry about the right things. Jesus was angry at sin. Jesus was disappointed in his disciples because they should have been doing better. And it exasperates him because he's been with them for more than a year by now. Robert Roberts says it this way in his book about emotions. He said, when you're too upset, you have to ask the question, are the right things at the center of my life? Because the emotional person, I'm quoting now, is weak, not because he has emotions, but because he has poor ones or a limited repertoire. The concerns his emotions go back to are momentary, primitive, immature, and badly ordered. He lacks personal integration, not because he feels, but because he feels strongly about the wrong things. Brothers and sisters, care about the right things. Get your emotions going about the right things. Jesus is emotional. He's frustrated. There's such a thing as godly frustration and exasperation because his disciples should be doing better. And I'm not saying he looks to us and sees frustration, but he wants us to do better. And he sometimes looks at us and says, these my children, he loves us, he always loves us, unfailing, unending love. These my children should be doing better. So don't be so emotional. Say to yourself, let's get our emotions in order. Come out of a right heart. Well, back to the story. Jesus sees the scene, hears the father's dismay, and he says, bring the boy to me. And when it happens, the evil spirit comes over him, and he goes into a fresh convulsion. He's rolling around on the ground, and Jesus and the father are kind of watching him rolling around, foaming at the mouth, becoming rigid, almost like a doctor surveying a scene or watching a patient who's in real trouble, maybe bleeding profusely, but he's not rushing because he has to know what the problem is. So with physicians, so with Jesus, the great physician. What do we have here? And the father says, what we have here. This has been going on his whole life. From childhood, this demon has cast him into fire and cast him into water. And the father is shaken because the disciples failed to come through. And so he says, but Jesus, if you can do anything, have compassion on us and help us. And Jesus hears those words. He hears those words, if you can. Now, in the original language, there's a way to sort of bracket words out. You put a definite article in front of the whole phrase. I heard the, if you can, that came out of your mouth. I heard that, if you can. What do you mean, if you can? Everything is possible for one who believes. Nothing's impossible with God. Jesus is the great Redeemer. What do you mean, if you can? Now, the truth of the matter is, people do ask the question, and they ask it sincerely, why has God not done anything? And they begin to have questions. This can be personal, such as, my son's been sick his whole life, or some long-standing personal crisis. God, why don't you do anything? We also feel it at a larger scale, right? Why did God allow World War I, World War II, the Holocaust, the wars that are going on today? Why does God permit tyrants to kill people in their own lands by the millions? This happened in Russia and China and other places. God, why don't you intervene? Now, there are answers to these questions. One answer is human agency is real. God lets people actually do things that have consequences. He doesn't stop people from doing what they intend to do. It's also true that God sometimes lets humanity go. In the book of Romans, several times it says, God gave them over. You insist on rebelling, I permit you to rebel. Sometimes God takes an evil deed and turns it for good. As Genesis 15:50 said, you meant it for evil, but God meant it for good. But don't misunderstand, I'm not trying to solve the problem of evil right now. This is not an answer to questions posed in the book Atheism for Dummies or that website you can find, things that make Christianity look bad. It's a real question brought by a real man. Why are your disciples not healing my son? There's a woman named Marilyn Robinson who's a wonderful novelist, wins awards. She's also a very dedicated Christian and a sort of a lay theologian. And her books, most famous of which is called Gilead, explore matters of faith. Gilead's about two pastors and their lifelong friendship. It's a wonderful book. And in that book, she has one of the characters say, if you have doubts, let them be real. Let them be honest doubts, not the questions that are in vogue at the moment. Let them be your questions, serious questions by genuine seekers. And it's good advice. If you're saying, I believe, help my unbelief, if that's truly what you're saying, then say it to God. Wait for the answer. Does God always answer our prayers as we wish? He does not always answer them as we wish, and we don't always know why. But we can still say, Lord, I believe, help my unbelief. Who says things like that? Who says, I believe, help my unbelief? Real people. When I heard about my friend who had to leave the ministry because he got into alcohol and one thing followed another, I was shaken. Because it's happened too many times. And sometimes you're shaken. And so we say, Lord, I need your help. My hopes have been dashed, as this father's hopes were dashed. I had begun to hope again. Your disciples couldn't help. I believe, help my unbelief. And he takes that, the beauty is he takes it to Jesus. He says, to Jesus, I believe, help my unbelief. And Jesus says, essentially, we'll handle that in a second, but right now, I'm going to rebuke that evil spirit, and I'm going to heal his disease. And so he commands the demon, leave him. The demon convulses the boy one more time. He's so traumatized by it, the people think he's dead. Jesus says, get up. He's better now. And now we can address the question. What does it mean, I believe, help my unbelief? It means that when we say things like that, Jesus answers. Because we don't have to have perfect faith. Listen, I've said this before, in my year with you, I'll say it again. Our standing before God does not depend on the quality of our faith. It depends on the object of our faith, that is Jesus. We're not saved by having faith. We're saved by having faith in Jesus, the Redeemer. So when Jesus hears the words, I believe, help my unbelief, he says, good enough. I'm not asking you to have perfect faith. I'm asking you to have faith in me. And that can change things. I don't know if you've been watching our culture and little trends. I'm sure you have. We watch different things. I've been watching the ideal in our culture of telling your story. There's a great emphasis on people telling their story. And that's not a bad thing. It can be good, certainly. But I do notice when people tell their story, they tend to emphasize their heartaches and the woes that came their way. I had a childhood disease, they may say. I have a minority status of some kind. My parents divorced when I was 7. Whatever the story may be, I had a cruel coach. Somebody fired me from a job, my first and best job, for no reason. People tend to tell their story in a sort of a dead-end kind of way. I listen to Taylor Swift sometimes, and she sings about bad boyfriends. She sings about bad boyfriends a lot, actually. But there's something about her that I want to point out, and that is, she's had a bunch of bad boyfriends, but she's doing all right. You know? She's a billionaire. She's going all over the world, and there's something, I think, I'm not sure about this, but I think one of the attractions to Taylor Swift is she's had so many bad boyfriends, but she's still pretty healthy about it. She's still doing well. She doesn't let the bad things destroy her life. There's something positive in that for us. Now, I should have warned you that you were going to be called upon. I'm going to invite you to read responsive reading with me, and this is the moment we're going to put on the screen, because the Bible wants us to be realistic about the troubles we have in life, but not to be overwhelmed by them. In other words, Taylor Swift is on to something. It's from Psalm 129, verses 1-4, and it's a word spoken to Israel. And I'm going to say you're Israel, and I'm going to be the person leading. And if you are willing to join in, don't do it if you don't want to, if you don't have a desire. But this is a psalm that somebody gave to me when I was in a time of distress. One of my slightly older friends in the faith said, Dan, you need to spend time in Psalm 129. And I said, good call. And this is what it says. Greatly have they afflicted me from my youth. Let Israel now say, if you want to be your Israel, ready? You want to do it? Greatly have they afflicted me from my youth, yet they have not prevailed against me. Now this is me. This is the person who starts it. The plowers plowed upon my back. They made their furrows long. Pause for a second. The plowers plowed upon my back. They made their furrows long means you are really hurt. If somebody takes a plow up and down your back, you have been torn to pieces. You are never going to recover completely. There will always be scars. If someone took a plow to your muscles and sinews and tendons and your skin. The plowers, but I invite you to join in with me, the plowers plowed upon my back. They made their furrows long together. The Lord is righteous. He has cut the cords of the wicked. You know what that's saying? That's saying, look, I've had adversity in my life, but it doesn't dominate my life. It doesn't control me. There is no question they have greatly afflicted me, but they have not prevailed. And why have they not prevailed? Because the Lord is righteous and he cuts the cords. That is, the forces that bind us, the things that tie us down and make us weak. He has cut those cords so that my life can actually move forward. So it was with that father. It's a real hardship to watch your child desperately sick for his or her entire life. And he was shaken by it. But it changed. While I was writing this sermon, a man called me up. He said, Dan, I'm calling you on the 12th anniversary of my sobriety. I was with him when his life fell apart. He'd gotten into alcohol. Alcohol led to drugs. Drugs led to a lot of bad decisions professionally. He lost everything. He lost his wife. He lost his job. He was banned from his field of enterprise for the rest of his life. He lost everything. And he prayed. He said, Lord, change me. Save me. Remake me. And he calls me every year to say, hey, Dan, just want you to know, you were with me at the worst moment. God changed my life. My life changed, but God changed my life. I've been sober for 12 years. I couldn't be happier. I have rebuilt my life by God's grace. This is something that actually happens. Now, I've talked about Taylor Swift and I've talked about Alabama football, but I'm going to give a name, and B.B. Warfield and Robert Roberts, but I'm going to give a name that you probably all know, and that's the name John Calvin. John Calvin, if you're a visitor today, glad to have you, is very well loved and respected in Presbyterian circles. And he was respected at an early age. At the age of 26, he wrote a book, the first edition, very short compared to the others, of a book called The Institutes. And he was almost instantly somewhat famous in French and Reformed circles in the Protestant church of the time. And he was walking to his job. He's offered a job in a city called Strasbourg, but he had to take a detour, and so he went through Geneva, which is another city, and they just lost their pastor, and somebody said, I'm simplifying a bit here, it's kind of a 100-page story, but the basic idea is this. They said, we don't have a pastor, let's get John Calvin. He wrote that wonderful book, The Institutes, and Calvin was willing. He said, okay, and they got somebody alongside him named William Farel, and they led the church. And he was 26 years old and completely untrained for this kind of thing. And he started making mistakes. And he started to clash with his elders. And he said, these people can't take communion. And the elders said, well, that's a joint decision. You don't get to decide that by yourself. He said, well, if I don't get to decide it by myself, none of you can have communion either. In fact, nobody at the whole church can have communion. And they said, you're fired. And he said, okay. They said, you got a week to get out of town. He said, I only need 2 days, bye. But there was a problem. The problem was, where's he gonna go? Because everybody knew this is a very talented young man who has had some problems. He kind of clashed with people a lot during his first couple of years. Where's he gonna go? Well, he could go to Strasbourg where he got that invitation, where he's going in the first place. The only problem was he'd written a letter to the leader of the church at Strasbourg, who was one of the most important, if not the most important Christian leader in Europe at the time, except for Martin Luther, number 2 probably in the whole European scene. And he'd written a 10-page letter to Butzer telling him all the things he'd done wrong. He's just a 27-year-old talking to a 55-year-old saying, I'm so tired of that pious shuffling of yours. That doesn't sound very good. He criticized one of his books that had recently been published. Calvin said, the book is so thickly settled with blemishes, the best remedy would be a single sweeping erasure. And for 10 pages, he wrote like that. They didn't know what to do. They said, he's godly, he's pious, he's learned, he's hardworking, he just has bad judgment. What are we going to do with him? Butcher said, I'll take him. I'll take him. I'll put him under my wing. We'll have a little chat about what he wrote to me, which became public. Calvin made terrible mistakes at the age of 28. Probably most of us could say, I made terrible mistakes at the age of 28. You remember some things you did in your 20s you hope everybody else forgot about? How about when you're 38, 48, 58, 68, 78? We make mistakes. Nobody's perfect, but it's not the quality of our faith, it's the object of our faith. We really want to be godly men and women, we do. We want to have a Christ-formed life like the best people we know. And when we fall short, we're still adopted into the family of God. God still loves us and rebukes us and corrects us, even as Jesus corrected his disciples. The disciples said, what went wrong? Why couldn't we heal this boy? And Jesus said, because you didn't pray. Because you got mechanical, because you thought you had it under control. These are spiritual matters. You can't just show up and say you're healed. That's what he says in Mark. Over in Matthew, he says, because you have such little faith, not because you have no faith, because of little faith, and it has consequences. A poor and a weak and a mechanical faith has consequences, but everything is possible for the one who believes. Not for the person who believes perfectly, but for the one who believes. It believes enough to say, I believe, also help my unbelief. Jesus says, good enough, good enough. And you can go through this world and see your life get better in your work, your family, your politics, your self-discipline, your relationships, you name it. With faith, by God's power, all things are possible. And when we say, I have a hard time believing that, Lord, help my unbelief, Jesus says, yes, everything is possible for one who believes. Let's pray together.